This afternoon, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for the lunch, who is Dr. Howard Spivak, who is the Acting Director of the National Institute of Justice, the Office of Justice Programs. His bio is in the program, so I am not going to go over that bio. Needless to say, you are in for a treat as he talks about the research that he is doing at the Institute and the need for and practice of diversity and inclusion that they have in practice or in place at the Institute. So without ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Spivak if he will come to the podium.
Good afternoon. Oh my God. You know, talking at lunch is really a drag because if there's any physiologists out there, you know what happens to your body when you start eating. Your blood goes from your brain to your stomachs. I'm going to need a little energy from you guys, particularly because I got out of a sick bed today to come here. So good afternoon. Okay, that's a little bit better. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to talk about the National Institute of Justice and some of the work we do. But I want to start by telling you a little bit about what the National Institute of Justice is, because when people think about the criminal justice system, they don't jump to thinking about science. But we are essentially the NIH of the criminal justice system with two very big differences. NIJ, National Institute of Justice, is an applied science agency, so we support and fund science that is clearly linked to advancing the practice and/or policy related to criminal justice, as opposed to NIH, which tends to fund a lot of very basic research, in addition to some applied research. The other difference, which is, from my perspective, particularly important, has to do with money, and that is NIH has $30 billion, and we have about $250 million. So that's a huge difference for us. So we have a relatively modest amount of money to support the science of a major element of our society in this country. The range of science that we cover at NIJ ranges from the whole spectrum of forensic sciences, from DNA to that you see on some of the TV shows on CSI and other things like that, to development of technology and technological standards for equipment and technological activities in the criminal justice system, to all of the behavioral sciences that contribute to our understanding, not only of the criminal justice system itself, but what affects people's behavior that leads them to be at risk for being involved with criminal justice and/or involved with violence of various sorts. So it's a really huge agenda. Now, it's hard for me to talk about science and not talk about diversity. You know, before I came to the National Institute of Justice, I was actually at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, where I was running the Division of Violence Prevention. And I'm driving to work one day, and I'm listening to National Public Radio, and they start reporting about a study that looked at a huge spectrum of research that had been published in the literature to determine what seemed to be the factors that influenced the research that got the most play and made the greatest contributions to science, at least based on NIH's experience. And what they found, which was not something they were looking for, was that the diversity of the research team doing the research was probably one of the most important factors with respect to the impact and quality of what came out of the scientific activities that they were doing. And the diversity that they found ranged from the range of disciplines of people working together on their research, to their backgrounds as individuals, to race, to ethnicity, to national origin, but that somehow bringing people together who have different perspectives, different training, different views of the world, creates a more challenging environment that leads to better science, which was a revelation of sorts. In fact, I almost got into a car crash because I was so actively listening to the story and so impressed with it and so impressed with the fact that they had looked at this. But I've carried that with me ever since hearing that, and one of the real priorities at NIJ is to enhance diversity of the people working at NIJ, to the people who are reviewing the proposals that people make to NIJ for funding, to the people who are getting funding from us, because it's such an important element to creating and achieving good science and good scientific outcomes. Now, I'm not going to go into all of this slide. It's more complicated than it needs to be. But what I do want to say is that when we make decisions about what we're going to fund and how we're going to fund it, there's a huge process that contributes to what we decide our priorities are, ranging from input and interactions with stakeholders in the criminal justice system, as well as people affected by the criminal justice system, to a constant review of the literature and what science is already out there, to the portfolios and what's coming out of the work that we've invested in the agency, so that when we develop solicitations, requests for proposals, a great deal of work has gone into it to try to identify where the gaps in the science are that are needed to advance the work in the criminal justice system. Now, one of the things I'd like to focus on, in particular because of you as an audience, is the investment that we have made and are making in advancing the careers of scientists who can contribute to criminal justice research. And we have a number of opportunities because what we're trying to do is engage people in thinking about criminal justice as an avenue for their scientific interests from early on in their academic careers through their early faculty level positions to their more senior positions. And we have a number of activities and funding resources to do this. We have a research assistant program, and I'm going to go into this in a little bit of detail. Our graduate research fellowship program in both the STEM sciences as well as the behavioral sciences. We have a solicitation focusing on new investigators, since it's very hard for people early in their careers to break into the funding system because they're in competition with all these experienced senior investigators, and it's very hard to stand up to them, in particular because people's track record is part of what's considered when one is competing for funding out of various science agencies. To the W.E.B. Du Bois program, which is a program that specifically focuses on the interplay between race and gender and crime, to visiting scholars programs where we actually bring people into the National Institute of Justice to work with the scientists there and contribute to the work we're doing internally in the agency. So the research assistant program is specifically geared towards individuals who are currently in graduate training programs. It requires that you be at NIJ for a certain amount of time, which means you either need to relocate to Washington or be at an academic institution that's in the Washington area. We are somewhat flexible at this, so if people can come for a period of time and then go back to their institutions. But what's central in this is actually interacting with and working with the scientists that are at the agency itself. And what's important to recognize is that the students themselves don't actually apply. It's the universities that you're attending that apply for you. So the funding actually goes to the universities and then gets eventually to the students, either to support their tuition or to support research that they may be doing at the university itself. I think what's particularly beneficial about this is not only that you get some financial support for the work you're doing, but also that you get the opportunity to interact with experienced scientists doing criminal justice related research. and really get to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty doing some of this work and interacting with people who have engaged and directed their careers in this field. I think it's an incredibly exciting opportunity. Generally, these fellows, these research assistants, come for a year, on occasion 2 years, if they're doing a particular project that requires more time. But it's an opportunity to really get exposed to the field and to get access to some experienced scientists in the field. The second area I want to talk about is our graduate research fellowship program. And as I said, we have a fellowship program in STEM sciences and a fellowship program in behavioral sciences. And in STEM sciences, we actually give up to 3 years of support for people in doctoral programs that can support their tuition, can support the cost of their doing the research itself, hiring research assistants yourself, and it cumulatively can be around $100,000 over 3 years. So for graduate fellows, that's a huge amount of money that's available. We have a behavioral science graduate research fellowship as well. It's a bit more modest. It's specifically geared towards people towards the end of their doctoral training. So generally, it's students who have completed their coursework and are actually completing the research related to their dissertations. And it's a single year of funding to support the cost of the dissertation research itself. And as I said, you'll get more details about this, including some specific examples of the kinds of research that the graduate fellows are doing in both the STEM sciences and the behavioral sciences. It's an incredibly rich range of research, from the behavioral science related to the effects of violence on individuals, to the risk factors related to people being involved in violence, to the development of the chemistry of forensics and DNA science, to some of the technological development that we're doing. And just to give you some examples, in DNA, the research that's been funded by NIJ has been a major contributing to advancing DNA analysis in this country. The technology research that's been done at NIJ has done things such as developing the modern body armor that's used by police officers that's actually saved about 3,000 lives over the past decade, to the behavioral science that deals with issues of the behavioral risks related to being a victim, to the risk factors that contribute to individuals who get involved in crime, to the interplay between substance abuse and crime, and so on. The next area I want to go into is our new investigator program, and this is particularly related to junior faculty, individuals who have completed their doctoral programs, but no more than, I think, 4 or 5 years beyond their doctorate. So it's early in their careers, and it's an effort to give new and young investigators the opportunities to be principal investigators on a major research project. Something that's really hard to do when one is a junior faculty at a university. And it takes you out of, as I said earlier, out of the competition with more senior investigators who have much more extensive track records, it's awfully hard to break into the funding system if you don't have opportunities like this. The next is the W.E. Du Bois Program on Race and Crime, and there's 2 elements to this. One is a fellowship program, which is for junior scholars, and particularly focused on research related to race and crime, or in some cases, gender and crime. It's modest funding of about $100,000 to $150,000 a year, depending on whether you're doing secondary data analysis or primary data collection. Again, the range of research that's been funded by this crosses the entire spectrum of, in particular, the behavioral sciences. And now more recently, we've developed a Du Bois Scholars Program for more senior researchers, with larger amounts of money, up to $500,000, who are more advanced in their careers, and this is specifically focused on primary data collection, not secondary data analysis. But one of the important elements of the Scholars Program is that part of the funding will support the grantee mentoring at least one, or preferably more than one, junior scholars to be working with them on their projects. So it's part of the pipeline of getting younger scholars and less experienced scholars into criminal justice research by working with more senior investigators. And lastly, we have the Visiting Fellows Program, and this is for researchers and or practitioners interested in science to come work at the National Institute of Justice and work with the scientists there, in particular to identify innovations in research. So this is not simply to do stuff that's already being done, but we have people who are coming in who are bringing fresh and new ideas and working with our scientists to develop either solicitations to support this research or actual research within the Institute of Justice. One really good example of this is that we had a visiting fellow a number of years ago who was a lawyer, who was a healthcare lawyer, and he brought the idea of doing what's called sentinel event reviews that have been used in hospitals to deal with learning from errors that are being made in the healthcare system to improve the system itself, not to assign blame, but to identify weaknesses in the system itself that can be changed that reduce the likelihood of human error. And the criminal justice system, as we all know, has constant problems with errors being made and things going wrong. And often the response to those errors is to point fingers and blame people, when more often than not there's weaknesses and failures in the system itself that have allowed people or have led people to make errors or have not had checks and balances that responded to errors before they became more serious. And so as a result of this individual's coming to NIJ, we're developing a huge national demonstration project of implementing sentinel event reviews across the criminal justice system. A major change in the system done by a lawyer interested in applying science to the criminal justice system. So that's just one example of the kind of work that individuals can bring. Now, just to give you a sense of some of the range that we have in the work we do at NIJ, I'd like to just simply describe a couple of the current solicitations that we have out in the public where people are submitting proposals for this current year. We have a huge initiative around research and evaluation in safety, health, and wellness in the criminal justice system, where we're funding projects that are looking at the factors that influence the health of people working in the criminal justice system and the effects of the criminal justice system on people who are involved with the criminal justice system. So we're looking at issues of stress and depression among police officers and corrections officers, where suicide is one of the leading causes of death of people working in those systems because of the stress and the constant trauma that they're experiencing. But we're also looking and doing research on things like the effects of incarceration on the children whose parents are in prison, or looking at the long-term effects of exposure to violence early in one's life as a huge risk factor for a whole spectrum of issues, including increased risk of involvement with violence and criminal behavior, as well as a whole spectrum of increased risk for chronic disease of various sorts. We're doing research in officer decision-making. That's been a huge issue in the public for a relatively long time, but it's become to increasing prominence, where excessive use of force has become a growing problem, and where it's very clear that police officers need to have a better skill set for dealing with stressful situations rather than resorting to violent solutions that often are unnecessary if their skill sets are different and more accommodating to the situations they're dealing with. We're funding research looking at the consequences of various police strategies beyond just reduction of crime. We know that there are certain strategies, such as broken windows, which has been a very common practice among police departments lately, where we know that it reduces crime rates. But we're also beginning to learn that it has negative impacts on police departments and it has huge negative impacts on communities. So we're trying to apply science to better understand how these strategies are having secondary consequences that may make things worse in the long run, even though crime rates may fall, at least initially, when you implement programs. We're doing research on primary prevention of violence in communities. So the criminal justice system has historically been primarily a reactive system. When something bad happens, the criminal justice system scoops in and responds to it. But there are things the criminal justice system can do that can actually prevent violence and reduce the likelihood of violence in communities, that really change dynamics and change the relationships between police and communities. We're funding a whole spectrum of forensic science research. Again, not simply just DNA analysis, but everything from studying the patterns on bullets to footprints to better understanding how to test for various drugs, as synthetic drugs are changing almost on a weekly basis, and therefore our ability to identify those drugs needs to keep up with the changing chemistry of the development of these drugs. We're funding research on strengthening the medical examiner coroner system, where there can be better science applied to understand why people die and whether there was some criminal involvement in death or not. And we're doing an extensive spectrum of research on evaluation of victims of crime, the effects of crime and violence on individuals, the impact of services applied to those individuals and whether those services are even making a difference in their lives or not, and whether there are ways of improving the healing process for people who have been victimized by crime. That's just a sampling of the kind of work we do. It's very broad and it's, I think, incredibly exciting work. So I hope some of you become interested in doing this work. The last thing I want to touch on, and I alluded to this very early in this talk, is that we're very much trying to diversify the individuals who are working with us to make decisions and recommendations about who we fund and what kind of research we fund. So we're actively recruiting peer reviewers for the applications we get, and we're trying to get individuals who become peer reviewers for us who don't come from the traditional criminology academic community, but come from the spectrum of STEM sciences and behavioral sciences, who can bring different perspectives in evaluating the proposals that we're getting. Because otherwise, if we have a monolithic group of people reviewing applications for us, we get monolithic results. And we keep funding the same things over and over again instead of becoming more interested in more diverse ideas and different ways of approaching various issues. So for those of you interested in doing peer reviewing, there's a way of going to the NIJ website and signing up and getting on the list, and you will unquestionably be approached to participate in that process. I'll also add that being a peer reviewer is a great way for learning what is successful for applicants at the National Institute of Justice, because by reviewing proposals, hearing other people's reactions to those proposals, you begin to learn a great deal about what represents good science and what represents innovative, impactful ideas that are more likely to get funded than not, and then you can apply that to your own efforts to applying for funding. Okay, I want to close by simply giving you access to more information about the work we do, and we have an extensive website. I encourage you to look at it, review it. It has information on all of the various training opportunities that I've been discussing and describing here. It lists all of the research we fund, so you can get a much clearer and better idea of the spectrum of research we're funding and the kinds of research that's successful in getting funding from us. It's a place where you can sign up to be a peer reviewer. It's a place where you can sign up to get alerts about releases of solicitations and requests for funding. So I strongly encourage you to write down this website, and if you forget it, just go to nij.gov and it'll get you there, one way or another. And I think on that note, I'm going to stop and I guess open things up for questions. So thank you.
Okay, let's thank our speaker one more time. Okay. Dr. Spivak has agreed to take questions, so we'll follow the usual protocol of coming to the mic, and I have to admit that with the bright lights, I can't find the mics out there, but oh, there's one. I see it now. There's one there. So if you would collect at the mic and make sure that you ask questions, let's hold the commentary down, but ask specific and direct questions, and we'll try to get answers to them. And while they are coming to the mic with the first question, I will ask one, and that is, so come on to the mic. I'm just filling in the time here. Given that students themselves cannot apply for many of the programs, could you talk more about the ways in which you get the information out to the public so that the correct people at the university know that they have the opportunity to nominate students for your program?
Well, actually, the applications for the graduate fellowships are directly, the applicants are the fellows themselves. It's not the university. Okay. So the funding goes to the fellows themselves. Mm-hmm. The awards go to them, and okay. The fellows are essentially the principal investigators okay. for those fellowships. Same is true for the young or new investigator awards. Mm-hmm. For the research assistant program, there's several ways that this can be done. One is that we do extensive outreach to the various academic departments that are related to the criminal justice research we do. I have to say that it is more focused on the obvious departments, the criminology departments. We're trying more extensively to reach out to STEM science departments as well as behavioral science departments. Mm-hmm. But also students can if they're interested in applying, go to their department chairs and ask them to apply for you. You're going to end up writing the proposal anyway. They're not going to write it for you. They'll be the ones that actually submit the proposals. More often than not, the students are the ones that initiate the process, but they do have to work through their grant system, their grant administrative system, to actually get the application submitted. For the graduate fellowships, as I said, the students themselves are the applicants, but again, it still will need to go through the grant administration units within your organizations. So you still have to involve the school because there has to be an administrative context for the funding to be able to come. But that's your funding. That's not, there's no middleman involved in those things.
Okay. I see we have a person at the mic left.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for the very informative talk. My name is Bishoy. I'm from Hampton University. So I have a little bit of a loaded question, so to say. So the thing is, with respect to the NIJ, right? So as a physicist, we spend a lot of time trying to model, the unpredictable nature of elementary particles, which it seems as if though the NIJ is rather interdisciplinary, because you can sort of try to model based on, known factors. You can try to predict, for example, criminal behavior, so to say, if you have enough sets of variables. So in that sense, you can actually come up, with some sort of, not only a way to predict crime, but perhaps to know the early triggers. So you could come up with preventative sort of measures if you include psychologists and all this kind of stuff. So I'm just wondering if, maybe everything goes poorly for me and I don't get into research, which is what I want to do, I'm just trying to see like what the NIJ has to offer, for example.
Okay, I'm sorry. I had trouble hearing the beginning of your question. What discipline are you from?
I'm an experimental nuclear physicist. So I'm particularly looking at elementary particles, dark matter, for example.
Okay.
But, yeah, so what we do is, you generally, as experimental physicists, we collect data and then we look at the spectrum, and then, we exercise our brains a lot, and then we try to come up with a model that sort of matches the data, so to say. So in that sense, we could essentially take a set of data samples from what we know about people and then use the same similar techniques to come up with a way to predict what could happen given certain circumstances.
That's actually a great question. We actually currently have a solicitation out now that's looking at predictability of crime in communities based on the data that is being collected in those communities. It's actually a competition going on. So we, in fact, are interested in predictive models, both in terms of potentially predicting when and where crime will occur, as well as who might be involved in that crime. This is a difficult area of research because you're walking a very fine line between applying prevention using predictive models and profiling communities and individuals in the process. So we're both interested in predictive models, but we're rather cautious that they be used properly and don't end up being used for the wrong reasons. But the science involved in this is something we're enormously interested in. We'd very much like to be able to prevent crime rather than respond to crime. We'd very much, given limited resources, like to use those resources in their most effective and efficient ways, which is really prevention, not response. My background is public health. I'm a pediatrician. I'm not a criminologist. Talk about diversity in criminal justice science. And as a public health researcher, my primary interest is, in fact, in primary prevention and being able to understand risk, understand resiliency and protective factors, and understand the elements that help us predict things in ways where we can, in a proactive and positive way, prevent things from happening in the first place.
Okay. Next question.
Thank you. My name is Suzanne Marie, and I'm a program manager at Central State University in Ohio. I appreciate the comments that you made and the fact that you want to look at this information to take it in a positive way. And I guess I don't know if you would cover this area, but my question involves when people are incarcerated. And we all know Google is never wrong, so I did a little research. And it says that approximately 12 to 13% of the American population is African American, but they make up 35% of jail inmates and 37% of prison inmates of the 2.2 million male inmates as of 2014. So my question is, once someone is incarcerated, what are we as a nation doing to help rehabilitate? So if they've not had the example set, if they've not had opportunity, are we doing something to go into that prison and help rescue that potential and that opportunity for the future?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's a very important area, actually, in particular, as there's a reversal of the trends that have been playing out for the last couple of decades in this country, where we're actually trying to depopulate prisons instead of populate prisons. And there's a whole substantial area of research that we're funding, looking at both successful strategies for rehabilitation within corrections itself, to the effective ways of assuring a positive reentry of people from prisons into their community, to alternatives to incarceration in the first place, and developing a more sophisticated community-based correction system where we can effectively provide rehabilitation and support for individuals rather than locking them up. We know for the most part that putting people in prison is not a very healthy activity. And there are significant consequences to being in prison, not only for those in prison, but for the extended family members involved with those individuals, and in particular their children. So putting people in prison is not something we think that is the best way to deal with things. There are alternatives. Once people are in prison, there are effective ways, or that we need to identify effective ways of assuring that when they leave prison that they don't end up in the revolving door of ending up back in prison again. And we very much are investing in research to identify strategies for keeping people out of prison in the first place.
My name is Cherie Finley from Alabama State University. Dr. Gunaz Javan is my research mentor, and we actually have submitted to the NIJ as of Tuesday. So fingers crossed. But I'm wondering, is there any chance that more funding will be put towards DNA and molecular research? And I know, that's our area of research, and I know the funding dollars are very limited. When you look on the website and see the different proposals that have been funded, we make up a very small percentage. So is there a push to help make the molecular eyewitnesses more of a focus at NIJ?
Yeah, yes,
you.
there is. Actually, our largest budget item at National Institute of Justice is forensics. It's about half of our budget. It's actually even a bit more than half of our budget. So it's one of our larger investments. I think the bigger issue is that National Institute of Justice is really about the only federal agency that's funding forensic research right now. There probably needs to be more involvement of other federal agencies to do this. It's interesting because the National Academy of Science has done several reports on forensic sciences where they've made huge numbers of recommendations to expand forensic science research and the investment in forensic science, not just DNA forensic science, but the whole spectrum of forensic science. NIJ is actually the only federal agency that stepped up to try to fill this void, but it's not something a single agency can do. But we actually put about $120 million or so a year into forensic science, which is, for us, a huge amount of money. For the science community, it's relatively modest, unfortunately.
Okay. Next.
Hi, my name is Paris Smith, and I'm from Jackson State University. My question is, well, I'm a firm believer that crime doesn't start with people going to jail. I believe that crime starts with limited resources. What are you guys doing to expand resources in less fortunate communities?
That's really important. The problem is we're a science agency, so we don't provide funding For programs themselves, there are other agencies in the Justice Department that do that, in particular the Bureau of Justice Assistance, that does most of that funding. What we do is that we fund the science that tries to better understand the factors that in fact create risk, that lead people to that. And much of this is social science research. It's not criminology research, it's social science research looking at the economic and social and environmental factors that create risk for involvement with crime and ultimately involvement with the criminal justice system. We also fund a substantial amount of research looking at the early exposure to violence and the risk that creates for individuals ultimately getting involved with the criminal justice system. Because we know that individuals growing up in violent communities are at much greater risk for becoming involved with violence as they get older, because it actually has biological effects on brain development as well as chromosomal development. So some of that science is extremely important. The programs to deal with the social and economic factors that contribute to crime come from other areas of government, other areas of the Justice Department, as well as other areas and other departments within government itself.
Thank you.
Okay. In the back, next question.
Hi, my name is Sam Rosenblatt, and I sort of have a question that's sort of similar to 2 questions ago, except my area of interest is network science, and I've read some network science papers about justice, like with like drug trafficking networks and like centrality in those, and seeing who would be best to target to like take down some sort of drug trafficking organization. And I was just wondering, what is the state of network science in the NIJ, and is like, again, like is funding increasing, decreasing? What some projects going on that relate to that? And
we're doing a modest amount of work in both drug trafficking as well as human trafficking, and better understanding and trying to better understand how to focus resources to not only respond to the problem, but to, again, get in earlier and prevent the issues. The National Institute of Justice is by no means the only agency funding this kind of research. There's research going on out of HHS in this area. There's research going on out of NIH in this area as well. But I think investing in science to better understand the networks that contribute to and carry out drug trafficking as well as human trafficking is central to reducing the problem.
Okay.
thanks.
Back right.
How are you doing today? My name is Harry Burton from Delaware State University. My question is related to the issue of increases in crime rates in general. I know that obviously there are many factors such as the area that you live, your parenting and all that. But I think one thing that often doesn't get talked about a lot is how certain chemicals in our, maybe like our food or maybe in our water supply might have an impact on us. I know that sounds a little out of place, but let me give you an example. Lead. Lead has an impact on neurological functions of young children, and that can also cause an increase in violent activities. But in fact, when we saw a ban of lead in paint, we also see a correlation. I can't say causation, but there was a reduced amount of criminal activity as you start to see over the decades after lead was banned. How much does the NIJ pay attention to these types of chemical components that can have an impact on
it's part of the work we do. There are other agencies that fund more of that, and some of that research is actually better funded out of NIH and out of the Center for Disease Control around those things. Given our limited budget, there's only so much we can do in this area, but there's no question that there are clear factors that increase risk, and some of them have to do with exposures to chemicals. Lead is a huge problem. It causes attention deficits, it causes subtle, sometimes not so subtle, learning disabilities. It has impacts on impulse control and a variety of other things that can create greater risk for people's involvement with crime. There's other heavy metals that are implicated in this as well, so lead is by no means the only one. It just is probably the more common exposure that individuals have. So there's a moderate amount of work going on in this. I will say there was a lull in the funding of that research as there was a misperception that this was being addressed and that exposures to lead were actually diminishing. What we've actually found is that lower level exposures actually can have significant and serious impacts. And so while the incidence of high lead poisoning has diminished, the incidence of low lead poisoning has not diminished. And so I think there's been a reinvestment in that work. It's not necessarily coming out of NIJ at this point, but it's coming out of other areas. And you just, to some extent, have to do some research in the various science agency government websites to identify where the best opportunities for that are. My guess is that the largest amounts of resources in that area are coming out of NIH right now.
Thank you.
Last question.
Yes, Tuskegee University. I'm Richard Whittington, and I wanted to talk about something personal. I wanted to find out about some of the life choices you made to get to your current position and what compelled you to take those actions.
That's a very long story, but as I said earlier, I'm a pediatrician. I was practicing early in my career primarily with children in inner city communities. I actually, it's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting thing. I actually was writing a grant proposal for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I think it was my second year as an assistant professor at Boston University School of Medicine. I was writing a proposal to get funding from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to develop a program to address issues related to high-risk youth from inner cities. And in doing that, I discovered that homicide had become the leading cause of death of teenagers and young adults in the city of Boston, both African-American young adults as well as white young adults, and was quite shocked by that, having been through 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency, 2 years of fellowship, and no one had ever mentioned homicide or violence as a health problem. And that got me very interested in the whole issue of violence and the factors that contributed to risk for violence, the factors that might reduce that risk, how to both prevent involvement with violence as well as respond to it more effectively, and the rest is history. I was involved with another physician who was an internist at the medical school in developing the first youth violence prevention program in the country. That was an incredibly successful program that actually led to almost 3 years without a juvenile homicide in the city of Boston. And from there, my career just took off, and I ended up eventually at the Centers for Disease Control, started doing collaborative work with the Justice Department, and they recruited me to come over there.
Okay.
So that's a quick, dirty summary of how I got where I am.